What if the very foundation of a global movement built on trust, honor, and healing began to crack, exposing not just mismanagement, but betrayal from the very top? What if the symbol of courage himself, Prince Harry, was suddenly at the heart of a scandal so explosive it could shatter the very legacy he worked so hard to build? These aren't just hypotheticals anymore. They are the swirling storm clouds over the Invictus Games, an institution born out of pain, triumph, and a prince's desire to serve. Now, with $45 million reportedly unaccounted for and a lawsuit filed by the very chairman who helped shape the organization, everything hangs in the balance. From the moment the Invictus Games were announced, the world stood still. Here was a prince who had served in uniform, who had known the sting of war and the hollowness that comes after. This wasn't a publicity stunt, it was personal. And that personal connection ignited a global fire of admiration. The games were not just about athletic competition. They were about resilience, about finding light after unimaginable darkness. Wounded veterans, many missing limbs, others carrying invisible scars, were given a stage, a voice, and a family. The Invictus Games became a beacon of humanity. And at the center of it all, Prince Harry stood, not as a royal, but as a comrade in arms. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But the light that burns the brightest casts the darkest shadows. For years, the games flourished. Governments, philanthropists, celebrities, and corporations opened their wallets and hearts. From Orlando to Sydney, from The Hague to Toronto, every iteration of the Invictus Games brought with it stories that made headlines, that brought tears to eyes and reminded the world that strength is not measured in medals, but in the courage to rise after being broken. The brand was clean, powerful, and sacred, and Harry, now distanced from the British royal family, clung to this as his proof of purpose. In a post-royal world, Invictus was his legacy, or so he thought. Then came the murmurs. Quiet at first, delays in funding, complaints from suppliers, canceled payments to contractors, promised grants to veterans and support organizations that never materialized. Most chalked it up to growing pains or bureaucratic hurdles. But inside the organization, the air had shifted. Something was off, very off. The chairman of the board, a respected figure with deep ties to military charities, had grown increasingly uncomfortable. He had seen discrepancies, statements that didn't align, and financial commitments that evaporated without trace. He raised flags. He asked questions. And, according to insiders, he was met with silence. Or worse, evasion. What happens when a whistleblower is ignored? When someone close to the heart of the mission is told to step back, to stay quiet, to trust the process. For a while he did. He trusted. After all, this was Prince Harry, the man who held grieving veterans in his arms, who sat with Gold Star families, who looked into the eyes of those who had lost everything and promised they were not forgotten. But trust, when violated, becomes something altogether more dangerous. And so, after months, possibly years, of internal struggle, the chairman made a move that stunned the world. He filed a lawsuit against Prince Harry, the man he had once stood beside, the man he believed in. The lawsuit, though still sealed in many of its details, reportedly centers on the disappearance or mismanagement of $45 million in Invictus Games funds. Let that number sink in. $45 million. That's not an accounting error. That's not a miscalculation. That's an earthquake. In the days that followed, headlines erupted. Social media exploded. Allies turned into skeptics. Supporters became investigators. And through it all, Prince Harry remained notably silent. No statement. No interview. Just a carefully worded message from his legal team denying wrongdoing and pledging cooperation. But cooperation with what? If he's innocent, why not stand before the cameras and speak directly to the people who trusted him? And where does Meghan Markle fit into all of this? While she isn't named in any legal filings, insiders suggest her increasing influence over Harry's ventures, including Invictus, may have played a role. From branding to media deals to nonprofit structure, Meghan's presence, strategic and relentless, has become impossible to ignore. Did her Hollywood-style management transform a sacred charity into a commercial engine? Or is she being scapegoated for decisions Harry made himself? That question alone divides the public. Some see a power couple trying to do good in a world that constantly tears them down. Others see ambition cloaked in empathy, where victims are turned into stepping stones for brand building. The consequences of this lawsuit go far beyond legal fees and courtroom drama. This is a direct assault on the integrity of the Invictus Games. For the veterans who gave everything, who stood on those global stages and bared their souls, this feels like a gut punch. They weren't just participants, they were believers. They believed in Harry. They believed in the mission. They believed in the promise. What happens to a legacy when its founder becomes its liability? In the chapters ahead, we will explore this story in its full, gripping detail. We'll look at the financial trail that led to the chairman's explosive decision. We'll dive deep into the complex dynamics between Prince Harry and his inner circle. We'll hear from veterans, insiders, experts, and critics. We'll peel back the layers of a scandal that could redefine how we see the royals, philanthropy, and power in the modern world. But make no mistake, this is not just a story about money. It's a story about trust, about what happens when ideals collide with ambition, and about the fragile line between inspiration and exploitation. We are standing at the edge of a reckoning. The very soul of the Invictus Games hangs in the balance. And whether Harry emerges from this as a fallen hero or a misunderstood champion will depend not just on court documents, but on something deeper: truth. It began with a flight home from Afghanistan, not a royal procession or a parade, just a weary soldier, seated among his brothers in arms, silently bearing witness to the invisible scars carved by war. That soldier was Prince Harry, and that moment, though never televised, was the quiet seed of something monumental. What he saw? Young men missing limbs, women whose eyes were glazed over by trauma, comrades who had served, sacrificed, and returned to a world that didn't know how to welcome them back, shook him to his core. Prince Harry may have been born into opulence, but war stripped him of titles. It made him human. It made him equal. In those desert sands and tense outposts, he wasn't a duke or a prince. He was just Captain Wales. And that was all he needed to be. But with that role came a responsibility he didn't expect. He became a witness to wounds that society couldn't see. Veterans returning home found themselves lost in a fog of pain, both physical and emotional, left to fight a second war. This time for dignity, purpose, and identity. That reality haunted Harry. So, when his second deployment ended and he returned to the UK, he carried that weight with him, not in silence, but in resolve. He began working behind the scenes, reaching out to military organizations, therapists, sports coaches, and rehabilitation centers. He wasn't just attending galas or giving speeches. He was listening, asking, learning. And what he heard, again and again, was the power of sport. Sport as therapy. Sport as a bridge. Sport as a mirror that reminds you, even without a leg or with post-traumatic stress, you are still a warrior. Then came the spark. In 2013, Harry attended the Warrior Games in the United States, an athletic competition for wounded, ill, and injured service personnel and veterans. He was visibly moved, not just by the games themselves, but by the stories behind them. The athlete who had lost both legs but finished a race on blades. The blind archer who hit every target. The Marine who collapsed at the finish line but still smiled because he finished. These were not just competitors. They were reminders of what it means to refuse defeat. The idea formed quickly after. Why not create a global version of this? Why not give veterans around the world a chance to compete, to heal, to tell their stories, not as victims of war, but as champions of resilience? Harry returned to London electrified with vision. Meetings were called. Sponsors were approached. Logistics began. And in less than a year, the first Invictus Games were born. The name Invictus was no accident. Latin for unconquered. It was a rallying cry for those who had faced death and chosen to keep going. A poem by William Ernest Henley, often quoted in quiet military corners, captured its essence. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Those words became more than literature. They became the creed of a movement. The inaugural games took place in London in 2014. It was an instant success. More than 400 competitors from 13 nations, tens of thousands of spectators, emotional ceremonies, tears, laughter, cheers. Royals and celebrities mingled with wounded soldiers who, for once, didn't feel like exhibits of sympathy, but stars in their own right. For many, it was the first time since their injuries they felt seen, not for what they lost, but for what they still had. Harry's speech at the closing ceremony echoed around the world. He didn't talk about himself. He talked about them, the competitors, their grit, their refusal to be defined by scars. He told them, "These games have shown a spotlight on the unconquerable character of servicemen and women and their families. You have inspired everyone who has seen you. You have moved and entertained us. You have given us hope." In that moment, a prince became a purpose-driven symbol. The games weren't just about medals. They were about momentum. Veterans who had considered suicide began speaking openly about hope. Governments were pressured to improve care. Families found new support networks. The ripple effect was seismic. The Invictus Games Foundation was formed soon after to ensure the legacy would last. Its board of directors included military officials, nonprofit leaders, and key figures with expertise in health, rehabilitation, and global event planning. The mission was clear: put the needs of wounded veterans first, no matter the cost. No exploitation, no grandstanding, just service through sport. Subsequent games took the torch forward. Orlando in 2016, Toronto in 2017, Sydney in 2018, and The Hague in 2022. Each event grew in scope and scale. More countries joined. Media coverage exploded. Athletes began training year-round. Teams formed bonds across borders. The games weren't just an event, they became a family, a global tribe. Prince Harry remained the face of it all, not as a distant figurehead, but as a present, emotionally invested force. He wasn't afraid to shed tears. He hugged competitors. He cheered from the sidelines. He spent time with their families. He asked about surgeries, nightmares, children, and jobs. He wasn't doing it for cameras. Many moments were never filmed. They were private, sacred. But as with all noble efforts, complexity crept in over time. The games grew. So did the funding. And with that came an inevitable shift from passion to protocol. Large donors began expecting deliverables. Government grants came with red tape. Corporate sponsorships brought branding demands. Somewhere along the way, the purity of Invictus began mingling with the machinery of global nonprofit politics. To manage all of this, the board expanded. More voices entered the room. Prince Harry's time became split, especially after stepping down from royal duties in 2020. Now operating from the United States, he balanced Archwell, personal media contracts, security concerns, and fatherhood alongside Invictus. It was too much. Some say he delegated too freely. Others argue he trusted the wrong people. That's where the chairman came in. Appointed for his military service and nonprofit acumen, the chairman wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a believer. He had watched the games transform lives. He had shaken the hands of competitors who once couldn't even walk. He had cried with mothers whose sons smiled for the first time in years after winning gold. He believed in Invictus not as a brand, but as a lifeline. And so, when he noticed irregularities, when invoices didn't match, when program budgets were suddenly gutted, when internal audits were delayed, he didn't panic. He asked questions, but answers didn't come, or they came late, vague, confusing, carefully worded. This wasn't about micromanagement. This was about survival. For him, every lost dollar was a missed prosthetic, a canceled therapy program, a homeless vet without shelter. He pushed harder, privately at first, then with urgency, until the tipping point came. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how this once beautiful story began to unravel. How the very leaders trusted to protect the soul of Invictus may have let ambition, distraction, or worse, greed, taint its mission. The cracks were forming. The chairman saw them, and what he did next would change everything. From the outside, the Invictus Games always looked pristine. Shiny medals, moving speeches, roaring crowds, and poignant montages that brought viewers to tears. But like any organization that operates on the world stage, what the public sees is only the polished surface. Beneath the camera flashes and edited press releases was a complex machine, one with layers of leadership, competing priorities, and a chain of command that would eventually become central to the scandal now unfolding. While Prince Harry was the founding visionary and the emotional face of Invictus, he was not the one signing the checks, reviewing the ledgers, or negotiating every vendor contract. That responsibility fell to a small but powerful network of executives. Most notably the Invictus Games Foundation's Board of Trustees and the executive chairman. The foundation, a registered charity, was structured like many international nonprofits, a ceremonial figurehead at the top, and a team of professionals and advisors handling day-to-day governance. The chairman was one of those figures who had both the credentials and the credibility to carry the weight of that responsibility. Decorated for his service, widely respected across military circles, and with years of experience in nonprofit financial oversight, he was no celebrity, but rather a man of quiet discipline. He had no desire for the spotlight. His focus was the mission, and that's what made his voice so powerful when things started going wrong. In the beginning, the dynamic between Harry and the chairman had been one of mutual admiration. Harry brought the heart, the visibility, and the funding power. The chairman brought structure, accountability, and systems. Their partnership worked because it was rooted in shared purpose. But as years passed and the scale of the games grew, the simplicity of that relationship gave way to bureaucracy and, some would say, tension. Sources close to the foundation describe a gradual shift. After the royal exit, Harry became harder to reach. Meetings were delayed. Instructions were passed through intermediaries. Public appearances were managed by publicists rather than mission-focused staff. Meghan Markle's influence also began to be felt more prominently, particularly in areas of branding, partnership strategy, and media messaging. The couple's production company, Archwell Productions, had started crafting Invictus-themed content, including a major Netflix docuseries. The line between charity and commerce was beginning to blur. It was within this context that the chairman started noticing things that didn't sit right. At first, it was small discrepancies. A marketing expense that seemed unusually high, a subcontractor hired without board approval, a project that received funding but never produced deliverables. He brought them up in internal meetings, expecting clarification. But what followed, according to people familiar with those conversations, was a series of vague responses and circular explanations. The Foundation's Finance Committee, once a tight-knit team of experts, had reportedly become a revolving door of short-term consultants and media liaisons. Key advisors were stepping away quietly. One former member, speaking anonymously, said, "It started to feel less like a charity and more like a startup chasing media relevance." As part of his role, the chairman had access to quarterly financial reports and internal audits. These were usually formalities, dry, predictable, and within expectations. But over time, those reports began to look different. Some were late. Others were full of placeholders. Figures didn't match across documents. Donations that had been earmarked for specific veteran programs were instead lumped into generic outreach categories, making it hard to trace where the money actually went. One particular report stood out, a detailed breakdown of international donations and their allocations. The numbers were staggering. Tens of millions raised from global campaigns and high-net-worth donors. But the line items showing how those funds were spent were murky. There were repeated entries for strategic development, brand expansion, and digital outreach, but few details on actual veteran services. The red flags were no longer subtle. The chairman decided to act. He requested a full audit, an independent, third-party review of the foundation's books. This wasn't a hostile move, but a protective one. Audits are standard practice in charities of this scale, and for an organization built on trust, transparency was non-negotiable. But the response he received, as described by insiders, was far from cooperative. The audit was delayed, then postponed again, then reframed as not necessary at this time. Legal language began to appear in internal communications. A lawyer close to the foundation reportedly advised the board that an audit could complicate pending negotiations with media partners and jeopardize confidential financial relationships. The chairman pushed back, but he was now facing resistance not just from consultants, but from within the board itself. It's important to understand what was at stake here. Charities like the Invictus Games Foundation operate in a delicate balance. They need media attention to survive, but too much scrutiny can bring uncomfortable questions. They need big donors to fund operations, but those same donors often expect influence. And they need credibility with the public, something that can vanish in a single news cycle. Faced with growing resistance, the chairman began documenting everything: emails, meeting transcripts, financial summaries. He quietly began consulting with external advisors, asking how to proceed if an internal financial concern could not be resolved through standard channels. His primary concern wasn't reputation, it was mission failure. Because if funds were being mishandled, it wasn't just a breach of trust. It was a betrayal of the very people Invictus was meant to serve. He wasn't the only one worried. Every dollar raised under the banner of Invictus carried more than monetary value. These weren't just funds, they were symbols of collective belief. People gave because they believed in second chances, in wounded warriors reclaiming their lives, in a prince's mission to turn pain into purpose. But somewhere along the way, millions of those dollars, 45 million, to be precise, reportedly disappeared. Not misplaced, not misfiled, disappeared. And the fallout of that disappearance is now rippling through an entire ecosystem of trust, legacy, and reputation. The number itself, $45 million, isn't just staggering. It's symbolic. That amount could fund the full cost of 2 Invictus Games cycles. It could cover rehabilitation programs for thousands of injured veterans. It could build infrastructure in developing nations to support disabled soldiers. And yet, according to sources cited in the lawsuit, the funds are unaccounted for, traced in pieces, dispersed through a spiderweb of shell accounts, unaudited grants, and questionable service contracts. So how does that happen? How does a world-class foundation go from global admiration to financial freefall? The answer begins in the years following Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure from royal life. Once they settled in the United States, their efforts to maintain visibility and income led to a flurry of new ventures: Netflix deals, Spotify contracts, public speaking engagements, and the launch of Archwell, a nonprofit organization with overlapping missions. Archwell was designed to focus on compassion and action, but its operations began to bleed into Harry's other projects, including Invictus. And that's where the lines blurred. According to insiders, the financial model of Invictus began shifting in this period. No longer entirely reliant on traditional charity fundraising, the foundation began securing high-profile sponsorships with major corporations, many of which came with clauses tying promotional access to future media rights. The boundaries between philanthropy and content development began dissolving. One executive close to the situation noted, there was this unspoken goal: every dollar spent needed to be brand-enhancing as well as mission-aligned. That goal, while perhaps strategic on paper, became a logistical nightmare on the ground. Funds earmarked for veteran housing were reportedly redirected into joint media ventures. Therapy initiatives were allegedly scaled back in favor of digital campaigns. A $3.5 million grant from a European donor reportedly vanished into a marketing expense filed under a U.S. subsidiary with no clear connection to veteran outreach. These were not accounting oversights. These were structural decisions. One of the largest unaccounted-for expenses involves what was supposed to be a permanent Invictus facility, a hybrid training center and rehabilitation complex built in collaboration with several governments and military charities. Ground was supposed to break in late 2022, with millions pledged in matching grants. But today, that land remains empty. Construction permits were never finalized. Vendor payments were suspended, and $12 million from the original building fund was quietly marked as reclassified to operational restructuring in the charity's annual report. It gets worse. A deeper dive into the foundation's ledger revealed a series of consulting contracts awarded to third-party firms, some of which had direct ties to executives at Archwell. One firm received $1.7 million for strategic narrative development, a term so vague that even board members reportedly asked for clarification. Another $1 million was funneled into what was described as platform optimization, yet no platform upgrades were ever publicly launched. Staff who questioned these transactions were met with deflections or silence. An anonymous former finance officer at the foundation spoke out, stating, "I felt like I was looking at a puzzle where half the pieces were intentionally missing. The numbers never added up, and when I asked questions, I was told to stop getting in the way of progress." But perhaps the most damning piece of the puzzle comes from whistleblower emails, leaked through internal legal channels and now reportedly submitted as evidence in the lawsuit. These emails show multiple senior staff raising concerns about unauthorized allocations and non-board-approved expenditures. One email in particular warned, "This will be a PR disaster if it gets out. We need to freeze the outgoing wire transfers immediately." That email was sent months before the lawsuit was filed. The board's response, largely absent. Several members were reportedly unaware of the extent of the financial discrepancies until after the chairman's decision to take legal action. And by then, the damage had already metastasized. What about Harry? That's the question circling every conversation. Was Prince Harry directly involved in authorizing these financial movements? Did he personally sign off on any of the questionable contracts or transfers? Or was he merely a distant figurehead, surrounded by people who shielded him from the inner workings of the machine? Publicly, Harry has insisted that he was focused on the mission, not the money. But emails from within the organization suggest he was made aware of several financial concerns. In one chain, a senior advisor mentions briefing Harry on budget concerns tied to media partnerships, while another references his approval to continue operations despite forecast deficits. It's entirely possible that Harry, overwhelmed with multiple roles and operating under the guidance of external advisors, trusted too freely. But trust doesn't absolve responsibility, especially not when lives are impacted. The $45 million now in question wasn't hypothetical. It was real. It came from mothers donating their savings, veterans pledging time, celebrities contributing their fame, and governments offering taxpayer-backed support. And now it's either lost or hidden. Attempts to trace the funds have led investigators to a troubling web. Some money was routed through shell companies based in Delaware and Nevada, states known for opaque financial loss. Other portions appear to have been transferred to short-lived holding accounts in the UK and the Caribbean, then emptied within weeks. Several of these accounts were registered under aliases, making it nearly impossible to track the end recipients without subpoena power. Legal analysts predict that forensic audits, court orders, and possibly international cooperation will be required to fully unpack the financial trail. But even if all the money is recovered, the trust that was spent, carelessly, arrogantly, and perhaps even knowingly, may never return. Because what hurts most isn't the loss of funds. It's the betrayal. Veterans who stood on those stages believed they were part of something pure. Donors who gave believed their money would bring healing, not headlines. And now, they're left wondering whether the entire operation was manipulated for image, for profit, or worse, for personal gain. In the next chapter, we turn our attention back to the man at the center of it all. Prince Harry, founder, champion, son of a king. We'll ask the difficult questions. How much did he really know? And at what point does negligence become complicity? Is he a fallen hero, or a man trapped in a scandal beyond his control? For many, Prince Harry is not just a royal or a celebrity. He is a symbol of transformation, of a soldier turned humanitarian, of a man who used personal trauma as fuel for global good. From walking behind his mother's coffin as a grieving child to founding the Invictus Games as a tribute to wounded warriors, Harry carved a rare space for himself in the public consciousness. A royal with empathy, a veteran with heart. So when his name appeared at the center of a scandal involving the alleged disappearance of $45 million from Invictus Games coffers, the shock reverberated far beyond tabloid headlines. But what is Harry's actual role in the scandal? Is he a mastermind, a misled dreamer, or simply a disengaged figurehead who trusted the wrong people? To answer this, we must first understand how involved Prince Harry has been with the day-to-day workings of Invictus. From the inception of the games in 2014, Harry was deeply embedded, not as a ceremonial figure, but as a man on a mission. He traveled to meet veterans in recovery centers, personally courted sponsors, and regularly attended planning meetings. Insiders from the early years describe him as hands-on, emotionally invested, and obsessed with getting it right. But everything changed after the royal exit in early 2020. Once Harry and Meghan Markle stepped down from their official duties and relocated to California, their priorities shifted. Between legal battles, explosive interviews, the launch of Archwell Foundation, and multiple media deals, the time Harry could dedicate to Invictus dwindled. In those years, the face of the games remained his. But the operational reins slipped increasingly into the hands of others, advisors, consultants, and executives, some of whom were connected to Archwell or outside business ventures. Critically, Harry's dual roles, as the face of Invictus and as a public brand entangled in commercial deals, introduced a dangerous conflict of interest. While he remained chairman of the Invictus Games Foundation, he was also spearheading production deals with Netflix and speaking engagements that leveraged his Invictus work as emotional currency. The line between charity and personal brand became increasingly thin. According to leaked internal emails and board meeting transcripts cited in the lawsuit, Harry was informed, at least on several occasions, about financial concerns raised by the chairman and other senior figures. One email chain, dated from mid-2022, includes a direct briefing note to Harry referencing operational red flags in the financial disbursement model. In that same thread, a member of Harry's personal staff replied, "The Duke is aware and will discuss next steps with senior finance officers." Whether that conversation ever occurred is unclear. Another document shows Harry authorizing a budget shift for a joint Invictus Archwell media initiative. This shift reportedly reallocated $2 million originally set aside for athlete housing and travel assistance to support content development. While there is no indication that Harry personally benefited from the money, the optics are troubling. Reallocating funds from veterans to support a Netflix production, even one intended to highlight those same veterans, crosses a boundary that many feel should never have been breached. Critics argue this moment marked the beginning of Harry's blind spot. He may not have acted maliciously, but he underestimated the power of perception. When donors give to a charity supporting war heroes, they don't expect their money to support entertainment production, even if it's inspirational. There is also the matter of delegation. Harry, by most accounts, was overwhelmed by the sheer number of projects he was juggling. Between personal security issues, family estrangement, the release of his memoir, and ongoing legal disputes with the British press, he began leaning heavily on external advisors. These advisors, many of whom were consultants with overlapping ties to Archwell, reportedly operated with wide discretion. Contracts were signed, deals negotiated, and funds moved with minimal oversight from Harry himself. This is where the debate intensifies. Some say Harry was naive, more concerned with optics and storytelling than with governance. They argue that he never anticipated being betrayed by those he trusted. Others suggest his disengagement was willful, that he knew what was happening, perhaps not in detail, but understood enough to see the ethical gray zone and chose not to intervene. Supporters insist that Harry, far from being complicit, is a casualty of fame and overextension. One former employee of the foundation claimed, Harry genuinely wanted the best for Invictus, but he was out of his depth. He trusted too much, delegated too quickly, and didn't understand the full scope of what was happening until it was too late. But legal analysts are less forgiving. They point out that as chairman and founder, Harry bears fiduciary responsibility. Whether or not he personally directed the financial mismanagement is irrelevant in a legal sense. If he knew, or should have known, about the misuse of funds and failed to act, he could be held liable. That's why the chairman named him specifically in the lawsuit, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a necessary step to seek accountability. There is also the matter of image. For years, Harry has crafted a narrative of principled rebellion, a man who walked away from the monarchy to pursue a life of authenticity and service. That narrative is now under threat. If proven true, the allegations tied to Invictus won't just dent his credibility. They'll dismantle the very persona he's built since leaving the royal fold. And then there's the emotional toll. Multiple insiders have described Harry as visibly shaken in private following the announcement of the lawsuit. One report claimed he held an emergency meeting with his legal team the morning the news broke, canceling all public appearances for the following week. Another said he called several board members personally, pleading for unity and patience as the legal process unfolded. Some responded with empathy. Others reportedly did not return his calls. Meghan's role during this period has also come under scrutiny. Though not officially involved in the Invictus Foundation's financial structure, her influence over Harry's professional choices is well documented. Several of the consultants now under investigation had prior ties to Markle-related ventures. Whether she encouraged certain decisions or simply approved them in passing is still unclear. But her proximity to the drama has only fueled speculation and intensified public backlash. Now, Harry finds himself at a crossroads. Does he step forward, take responsibility, and lead the charge for reform, regardless of personal fallout? Or does he retreat, protect his family and reputation, and let the legal teams handle the mess? Thus far, he's chosen silence, releasing only a brief, non-committal statement expressing concern for the impact this may have on the veteran community. But silence, in this context, may read as guilt. In the next chapter, we'll examine the moment everything came to a head, the day the lawsuit was filed. A day that shattered the illusion of invincibility surrounding Prince Harry and cast a long shadow over the future of the Invictus Games. Because while words may inspire, it's actions and inactions that define legacies. For months, tension had been simmering beneath the surface. Whispers echoed through closed-door meetings. Staffers walked on eggshells. Emails became more cautious, conversations more cryptic. The Invictus Games Foundation, once a shining symbol of global unity and recovery, had begun to feel like a battlefield. And then, without warning, came the detonation. On a quiet Thursday morning, news broke like a thunderclap. The chairman of the Invictus Games Foundation had officially filed a lawsuit against Prince Harry. The documents, filed in a London court and confirmed shortly after by multiple international outlets, alleged serious financial mismanagement and demanded a forensic audit of more than $45 million in charitable funds. It wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a public shaming. The media went into overdrive. Within minutes, the story dominated social media. Headlines screamed across platforms. Invictus implodes. Harry sued over missing millions. From hero to defendant. Comment sections erupted. Twitter trends exploded. News anchors speculated wildly. And in the midst of the chaos, two questions rose above the din. How could this happen? And why now? According to legal sources close to the situation, the decision to go public was not made lightly. The chairman had, by all accounts, exhausted every internal option. He had raised concerns quietly, pushed for audits, requested transparency, and been repeatedly ignored or deflected. Private mediation had reportedly been attempted. Confidential warnings had been issued. Yet nothing changed. The financial trail remained murky. Funds remained unaccounted for. And the damage to the foundation's credibility was growing. Insiders say the chairman made the call after a final, failed board meeting just weeks earlier. In that meeting, he presented a detailed dossier outlining financial irregularities, missing invoices, and unexplained transactions. He requested a full halt on all spending until a third-party investigation could be launched. His motion was voted down. Some board members expressed concern about reputational damage. Others suggested it would interfere with upcoming promotional events, including Netflix tie-ins and a planned U.S. fundraising gala. For the chairman, that was the final straw. He walked out of the room and reportedly told a colleague, "If they won't protect the games, I will." Within days, legal paperwork was drawn up, and in a deliberate act of symbolic defiance, the lawsuit named Prince Harry personally, signaling that accountability could no longer be deferred, delegated, or diffused. The filing outlined multiple points of concern: unapproved fund transfers, conflicts of interest between Invictus and Archwell, inflated media-related expenses, and discrepancies between public financial statements and internal records. It also alleged that Prince Harry, despite being informed of these issues, failed to act. In legal terms, the charge was dereliction of fiduciary duty. In moral terms, it was betrayal. The fallout was immediate and severe. Invictus Games sponsors, blindsided by the news, began issuing statements. One corporate donor announced a pause in funding, pending clarification. Another quietly removed Invictus from its list of affiliated charities. Philanthropic partners who had been planning future collaborations began pulling out of meetings. Emails leaked from within the foundation showed frantic damage control efforts, talking points being drafted, emergency Zoom calls scheduled, legal advisors scrambling. And the veterans? The very people the games were built to uplift? They were stunned. Some remained loyal, unwilling to believe that the man who had built Invictus with such apparent passion could be capable of negligence or worse. But others, especially those who had been promised support that never arrived, were furious. Stories began surfacing. A veteran who had waited 8 months for funding to attend a rehabilitation program. A family who had organized a local Invictus fundraiser and never saw the funds reach their intended destination. A double amputee who had been slated for a mental health pilot project that was abruptly canceled with no explanation. One former competitor, who asked to remain anonymous, said, "It's not just about money. It's about trust. We put our stories, our trauma, our hearts into Invictus. And now we're wondering if we were being used." Veteran groups worldwide began demanding answers. In the UK, Australia, Canada, and the Netherlands, countries that had heavily participated in previous games, calls for independent investigations grew louder. Several government officials publicly voiced concern. One British MP went so far as to suggest that if fraud was proven, Invictus should be permanently restructured under new leadership. As the firestorm grew, Prince Harry remained conspicuously silent. No press conference, no interview, no heartfelt video, just a terse, carefully crafted statement released by his legal team acknowledging the lawsuit, denying wrongdoing, and expressing regret that internal matters have reached this point. The statement pledged cooperation but stopped short of addressing any specifics. Meghan Markle also remained quiet, though public scrutiny of her role intensified. Photos from Invictus events were reanalyzed. Videos of her speeches were dissected for clues. Anonymous sources emerged, some defending her, others suggesting she had pushed for more commercial leverage from the games, even at the expense of veteran services. Conspiracy theories mushroomed. Was this a calculated attempt to profit? Or had the couple simply lost control of a machine they no longer fully understood? The British royal family, predictably, issued no public response. But behind palace walls, sources described a wave of disbelief and embarrassment. King Charles, who had been cautiously supportive of Harry's post-royal endeavors, was reportedly blindsided. Prince William, who has long maintained distance from Invictus in the post-Megxit era, allegedly expressed frustration at how the scandal might damage the monarchy's broader reputation. The chairman, meanwhile, stood firm. In a public statement following the filing, he said, "This is not about revenge. This is about responsibility. I believe in Invictus. I believe in its mission. But I cannot, in good conscience, remain silent while its integrity is compromised. This is not about politics or personalities. This is about the veterans. They deserve transparency. They deserve justice." His words struck a nerve. Public opinion, once firmly in Harry's favor, began to fracture. Polls showed a steep drop in approval ratings. Editorials once praising Harry's service began to question his judgment. Even some of his most loyal supporters online began posting cautiously worded calls for accountability and clarity. The chaos extended beyond the courtroom. Upcoming Invictus events were thrown into uncertainty. Sponsors hesitated to commit. Teams expressed concern about logistics. Several veteran-led nonprofits began calling for an emergency summit to assess the long-term viability of the games. As all of this unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. A reckoning not only for Prince Harry, but for an entire movement that had been built on the premise of honor, healing, and hope. The days following the lawsuit's filing were among the most tumultuous in Invictus history. Internally, the foundation was paralyzed. Externally, its image was imploding. And at the heart of it all was a singular, devastating question. What if the hero we believed in failed us when it mattered most? In the next chapter, we turn our focus to Meghan Markle. Her involvement in Invictus has always been polarizing, some calling her a co-champion, others a calculated strategist. But now, as financial trails and internal documents point to decisions made under her influence, we ask, did Meghan play a pivotal role in the unraveling of Invictus? Or is she simply collateral damage in a storm she didn't start? In any high-stakes story where fame, money, and public perception collide, it's rarely long before Meghan Markle enters the frame. Her name has become a lightning rod, sparking intense admiration from some and sharp criticism from others. But when the Invictus Games scandal began to unfold, it wasn't just Prince Harry who found himself in the crosshairs. Very quickly, all eyes turned toward Meghan, asking a question that no one in the organization seemed ready to answer out loud. How much influence did she have over the operations of Invictus? And more crucially, did her presence accelerate the breakdown that led to a $45 million lawsuit? To understand the gravity of her potential involvement, one must first revisit Meghan's entry into the Invictus narrative. When she first appeared at the Toronto Games in 2017, her first official public appearance with Harry, media attention exploded. Suddenly, Invictus wasn't just about veterans and recovery. It was about royal romance, glitz, and the entrance of a former American actress into a centuries-old institution. Her presence, while initially subtle, brought with it a new kind of global attention. Paparazzi followed the games more than ever. Tabloid spreads focused less on amputee swimmers and more on Meghan's choice of blouse. Some insiders, at the time, welcomed the added attention. More eyeballs meant more sponsors. More hype meant bigger events. But others were more cautious. One former event planner recalled, the focus was drifting. People started asking which celebrities would attend instead of which veterans would be honored. After Meghan and Harry's royal exit in 2020, that dynamic intensified. No longer constrained by palace protocols, the couple began building what many described as a media empire, one centered around compassion, storytelling, and advocacy. Archewell was launched as their official nonprofit umbrella, and it wasn't long before projects started overlapping. Meghan's influence was unmistakable. She wasn't just a supportive spouse standing behind Harry. She was a strategic voice, advising, directing, coordinating behind the scenes. Sources inside the foundation point to several moments where Meghan's fingerprints were evident. The first was the push for media integration. Soon after Archewell inked its deal with Netflix, reportedly worth upwards of $100 million, conversations began about incorporating Invictus into the content roadmap. Meghan reportedly supported the development of a docuseries that would follow competitors, their stories, and the emotional journey of recovery. On the surface, this seemed like a perfect marriage of cause and content. But some staff grew concerned when production budgets began eating into charity resources. One internal memo referenced a reallocation of discretionary funds toward media partner facilitation, language that raised alarms for the finance team. Another document outlined how event logistics would be coordinated with film crews, often prioritizing shot opportunities over athlete comfort. A former staffer bluntly put it, "We weren't planning a charity event anymore. We were producing a show." Then there were the consultants. After the royal exit, Meghan reportedly brought in a wave of American media strategists and PR professionals to help rebrand Invictus in the U.S. market. Some had no military background. Others had never worked with nonprofit organizations. Their focus, it appeared, was image management, crafting stories, pitching exclusives, optimizing press moments. Branding decks were redesigned. Social media strategies revamped. Events began to feature curated Instagram-friendly moments, with less emphasis on long-term veteran programs. The chairman, according to sources, raised concerns about this shift. He worried that the soul of Invictus, the quiet, hard-won victories of wounded soldiers, was being overshadowed by glossy packaging. But Meghan, those close to the process claim, saw things differently. She viewed storytelling as essential. She reportedly argued that emotional narratives and media attention were not distractions, but tools, powerful ones that could amplify the mission and bring in more funding. In theory, she wasn't wrong. Visibility can inspire donations, partnerships, and growth. But in practice, the rapid transformation created friction. Staff reported burnout. Veteran voices were allegedly sidelined in favor of camera-ready stories. And money that had once been set aside for recovery programs was, piece by piece, diverted toward brand building. The overlap between Archewell and Invictus finances remains one of the most contentious aspects of the lawsuit. Several consultants hired through Archewell were later found to have submitted invoices to Invictus. One vendor charged over $800,000 for narrative architecture and strategic audience alignment, a term many on the board had never seen before. Another received $1.1 million for impact analysis and audience growth modeling, services that had little to do with veteran welfare. Where was Meghan in all of this? Though not officially on the board of Invictus, she was frequently included in high-level planning calls. Her suggestions were described as strongly persuasive by those present. Emails obtained by legal counsel reportedly show her offering input on sponsorship language, event messaging, and production aesthetics. One email, in particular, raised eyebrows. It referenced ensuring a unified tone across Archwell and Invictus storytelling, a line that suggests brand fusion between two legally distinct entities. Critics argue that Meghan's approach to Invictus was less about charity and more about brand alignment, that she saw in the games a perfect vehicle to reinforce the couple's post-royal identity as champions of resilience and empathy. But her supporters counter that she brought much-needed modernization and reach to a mission that was otherwise fading from international consciousness. They claim she added polish, not poison. Yet the numbers speak for themselves. Programs promised in public statements were not delivered. Financial gaps widened. Vendors complained of unpaid invoices. And through it all, the media machine continued churning, telling uplifting stories while the foundation's internal structure buckled. In public appearances, Meghan remained poised and gracious. She smiled on stages, hugged veterans, gave tearful speeches about hope. But behind the scenes, the people tasked with keeping the games afloat were drowning in confusion and frustration. One former employee summarized the dilemma bluntly. Meghan brought Hollywood to Invictus. But the wounded warriors we serve, many of them don't need a lens in their face. They need a leg. They need trauma counseling. They need someone who's not turning their story into content. The lawsuit filed by the chairman does not name Meghan directly, but legal experts suggest her role may come into sharper focus as investigations continue. If evidence surfaces that Archwell consultants influenced Invictus expenditures without proper authorization, Meghan could find herself drawn into depositions or legal scrutiny, even if only as a witness. And if the blurred lines between charity and production are proven to have led to financial misappropriation, her judgment will be on trial in the court of public opinion. For now, Meghan remains silent. No statements, no social media posts, no interviews. The woman once known for her ability to shape narratives has gone dark. Perhaps on legal advice, perhaps out of fear that speaking now might ignite the flames further. But silence is not immunity, and absence is not absolution. In the next chapter, we dig deeper into the media deals that may have served as both the launchpad and the landmine for this scandal. Specifically, the Netflix connection. What began as a promising partnership turned into a potential web of conflicts and creative overreach. How much of Invictus was sacrificed in service of streaming content? And did the cameras that promised to elevate the games end up capturing its fall? At first glance, it seemed like a natural fit, a royal cause paired with a global streaming giant. When news first broke that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had signed a multi-million-dollar deal with Netflix, many viewed it as a savvy move. Archwell Productions would craft documentaries, films, and series aligned with the couple's values: resilience, compassion, humanity. Among those projects, one stood out immediately, a docuseries focused on the Invictus Games. It was presented not as entertainment, but as inspiration. But behind the polished press releases and feel-good talking points, the Invictus Netflix collaboration may have become one of the most significant points of contention in the financial collapse now at the center of a $45 million lawsuit. Titled Heart of Invictus, the series was intended to follow athletes on their journey to the 2022 Invictus Games in The Hague. Trailers promised raw emotion, intimate moments of struggle and triumph, and powerful storytelling that would bring global attention to the veterans competing. What wasn't promised, but soon became clear, was that this project would consume massive resources, introduce a complicated layer of financial entanglement, and potentially jeopardize the integrity of the charity it was meant to highlight. The production of Heart of Invictus was not merely a content deal. It was a logistical overhaul, filming across countries, coordinating with athletes, navigating security clearances, managing medical privacy concerns, and integrating high-profile appearances from Harry and Meghan. Every aspect of the production demanded precision, money, and cooperation. But according to internal documents, that cooperation came at a steep cost. The first red flag was funding. While Netflix shouldered the bulk of production expenses, several budget items, equipment rentals, location setups, athlete accommodations, and promotional events, were billed to the Invictus Foundation. One email leak suggested that shared promotional responsibilities allowed for cost allocations between Archwell and Invictus. But critics argue this vague language was used to disguise the diversion of charitable funds toward commercial production. According to financial records reviewed by independent auditors, close to $7.3 million was moved from Invictus General Reserves into a holding account used for event enhancement during the filming of the docuseries. This fund covered additional lodging for athletes to keep them near production hubs, on-site production assistants, and even specialized lighting and set design for select interviews. In one case, a full reconstruction of a veteran's home gym was reportedly funded under the justification of improving athlete experience, only for that space to become a recurring set in the series. Multiple staff members raised concerns. One logistics manager warned that production was dictating event schedules and that filming took priority over athlete rest and recovery. Another said several competitors felt pressured to participate, fearing exclusion or reduced support if they opted out. An anonymous volunteer wrote, "The line between helping these veterans and exploiting their pain was starting to blur. They were asked to repeat emotional moments for better takes. It didn't feel right." The show's release was delayed multiple times, partly due to post-production issues and partly because of growing internal discomfort. Meanwhile, veterans were left in limbo. Some who appeared in the series claimed they were never paid or even properly briefed on the final product's distribution. Others discovered their stories had been heavily edited or used out of context, fueling feelings of betrayal. Then there's the matter of residuals and revenue. While Heart of Invictus was framed as a charitable endeavor, Netflix reportedly retained full licensing rights. Archwell, according to contract insiders, received undisclosed compensation as executive producers. Invictus itself, the charity, received no direct cut of revenue generated by the docuseries. For a foundation grappling with financial deficits, that revelation sparked fury. Legal experts now reviewing the lawsuit point to this deal as a possible breach of fiduciary ethics. By allowing a commercial entity to leverage a nonprofit's resources and its vulnerable participants, without clear and measurable benefit to the charity itself, the board may have failed in its duty to protect Invictus's assets and mission. The documentary's rollout only added to the controversy. Promotional campaigns leaned heavily on Harry's personal involvement, with Meghan appearing in a few behind-the-scenes segments. Press junkets avoided financial questions and focused instead on the emotion of the athletes' journeys. But by then, cracks were already visible. Donors began asking where their money had gone. One prominent sponsor reportedly requested an itemized account of how their contributions were used during the production period. When none was provided, they quietly ended their partnership. A second donor released a public statement expressing disappointment at the current direction of the foundation, a thinly veiled criticism widely interpreted as referencing the Netflix deal. Athletes, too, voiced frustration. A former Royal Marine, featured prominently in the series, said, "I was promised my story would help others. Instead, I became a character in someone else's narrative." Another veteran, from Canada, claimed he was encouraged to speak about his childhood trauma for the cameras, only to later regret how deeply personal details were used to frame dramatic arcs in the show. And while the docuseries garnered moderate critical praise for its cinematography and pacing, reviews were mixed on substance. Some applauded the emotional candor. Others criticized the tone as overly manufactured. But almost universally, viewers were shocked to learn, after the scandal broke, that the very charity being praised was under investigation for missing millions. Netflix, for its part, has remained silent on the issue. When asked to comment on their contractual obligations or revenue-sharing terms with Invictus, representatives declined. Archwell, likewise, has not disclosed how much it earned from the series or how those earnings were used. That silence has only deepened public suspicion. So where does this leave the Invictus Games? In a precarious position. The organization now faces the difficult task of rebuilding trust, not just with donors and sponsors, but with the very people it claims to serve. The Netflix project, once viewed as a bold step into global visibility, may ultimately be remembered as the pivot point where mission gave way to monetization. The documentary still lives online, drawing clicks and sparking emotional reactions. But behind the scenes, the athletes it features are asking themselves if they were used, if their struggles were turned into streaming fodder, if the cause they believed in was packaged for profit. In the next chapter, we leave the Hollywood gloss behind and return to the old establishment. How has the British royal family responded to the scandal that now engulfs one of their most controversial members? Has King Charles taken steps to protect the crown's reputation? And what does Prince William, once Harry's closest confidant, now make of the brother who may have brought shame to a sacred cause? When scandals erupt involving members of the royal family, Buckingham Palace adheres to a time-honored approach: silence. Not because they lack an opinion, but because every word carries the weight of monarchy. Yet within those palatial walls, behind stone facades and heavily guarded gates, reactions aren't muted, they're managed. And in the case of the Invictus Games scandal, as Prince Harry's name became entangled in allegations of financial misconduct and betrayal, that silent fury grew louder with every headline. The royal family has always taken a distant but respectful stance toward Invictus. Even after Harry stepped away from his official duties in 2020, King Charles and other senior royals publicly praised the Games, recognizing their value for wounded veterans and their broader symbolic importance. But that goodwill rested on an assumption that Harry, whatever his differences with the firm, was upholding the values of honor, service, and integrity. The lawsuit changed everything. Though the palace issued no formal statement after the news broke, sources within the royal household say the reaction was one of shock and dismay. King Charles, who had already navigated the turbulent waters of Megxit, Oprah interviews, and Harry's memoir Spare, was reportedly livid, not at the media coverage, but at the implications. The very idea that one of his sons could be named in a lawsuit accusing him of failing to safeguard millions meant for war veterans reportedly hit the monarch with a level of personal and institutional embarrassment that was difficult to contain. Palace aides scrambled behind the scenes. Internal meetings were called, not just about damage control, but about contingency planning. Could this scandal be used by anti-monarchist groups to question the family's charitable legacies? Would Harry's continued association with Invictus reflect poorly on the royal patronages that remained? Could other senior royals be asked uncomfortable questions about their own financial dealings? The fear wasn't guilt by association, it was perception by contamination. Prince William, according to insiders, was furious. His relationship with Harry had already deteriorated since the Sussexes' exit from royal life, but this scandal struck a nerve. Invictus had once been a shared source of pride. William had supported its early stages and attended several events. But now, as the headlines painted Invictus with the brush of scandal, William reportedly saw Harry's actions as not just reckless, but deeply damaging to the family's collective efforts in the realm of military service. One insider close to Kensington Palace revealed that William privately told staff, "This was sacred. If you can't protect the veterans, what can you protect?" The comment, reportedly made in frustration during a strategy meeting, encapsulated the sense of betrayal many within royal circles were feeling. Even Princess Anne, known for her stoicism and military ties, reportedly voiced concern. As one of the royal family's most active patrons in veterans affairs, she has long championed military charities. The scandal surrounding Invictus, an initiative she once praised for its authenticity,